One by one, territories joined together, creating a patchwork nation of 50 different states, united, but each with its own history, spirit, culture, and landmarks. Let's explore the history of 5 of them. Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Hawaii, South Carolina, and Montana. Welcome to the States. This first state can boast of so many firsts that it's hard to keep count. It's the home of the first American flag, the first daily newspaper, the first oil well, and the first public zoo. And if that weren't enough, it was the first state to put its web address on its license plates. Greetings from Pennsylvania, the second of the original 13 colonies. It joined the Union on December 12, 1787. With a population of 12.4 million, it is America's 6th most populous state. Pennsylvania is known as the Keystone State for the role it played in the founding of this nation.
Pennsylvania was called the Keystone State originally because it was in the center of the 13 colonies. It had the largest city, Philadelphia, which at the time was the capital. And it was really the hinge state that kept the colonies together.
Pennsylvania is also known as the Quaker State, a tribute to founder William Penn's religious beliefs. In fact, the state's name is Latin for Penn's Woods. In Pennsylvania, there's absolutely no shortage of history. During the colonial era, Philadelphia was America's largest and most sophisticated city. Its central location made it the crossroads of the Revolution. Here in Independence Hall, the Founding Fathers gathered to create the cornerstone documents of our democracy: the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the U.S. Constitution. For all that Pennsylvania has given to the nation, it's made one other major contribution to the American experience that should never, ever be overlooked: ketchup.
Heinz 57 ketchup.
Heinz ketchup is the only ketchup I've ever known.
The ubiquitous red sauce that we know and love today was created in Pittsburgh in 1876 by Henry John Heinz.
His real talent was in marketing his product. He always said, the way to success is to do a common thing uncommonly well. Well, nobody made ketchup better than H.J. Heinz.
Moving from condiments to candy brings us to Hershey, Pennsylvania, known as Chocolatetown, USA. Milton Hershey started off making caramels in 1886, but after building his own milk processing plant, Milton became the first American to develop a formula for manufacturing milk chocolate. The rest is confectionery history. If you're from Pennsylvania, the odds are good that German blood flows through your veins. About 25% of Pennsylvania ancestry is German. In fact, the term Pennsylvania Dutch doesn't refer to Dutch people at all. It's actually a corruption of Pennsylvania Deutsch, meaning German. Today, the expression is often applied to the Amish, who trace their roots to reform-minded Mennonites in 17th century Europe. When persecution drove them to America in the 1720s, many chose to settle in Pennsylvania, attracted by William Penn's founding principles of religious tolerance.
The Amish were dissenters from the dominant religious powers in Europe, and they came to the United States with a very kind of pure agrarian philosophy and have remained relatively uncontaminated by the modern world.
The town of Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania has tapped into its own immigrant origins with a celebration that dates from 1886, February 2nd, 1886 to be exact. We know it as Groundhog Day. In Europe, they call it Candlemas Day.
The legend was that if the sun shone brightly on Candlemas Day, there would be 6 more weeks of winter. If it didn't, the weather would turn and we'd have an early spring. So when they got to the United States, instead of using badgers and hedgehogs like they did in Europe, since we don't have too many, the groundhog became the marmot of choice.
He's the royalty in Pennsylvania. He pretty much gets anything that he wants.
The folks in Punxsutawney have maintained the tradition for over 120 years.
His Majesty, King Philip! February 1st, you go up to Punxsutawney and party all night until dawn. Unfortunately, there's so many cameras around, he always sees his shadow. So we always have 6 more weeks of winter.
6 more weeks of mild winter weather there will be.
Half of Pennsylvania's population lives in the state's 2 major metropolitan areas, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is the heart and soul of western Pennsylvania, a city built at the confluence of 3 mighty rivers, the Allegheny, the Ohio, and the Monongahela. Down through the ages, these rivers carved wide gaps through the hills and mountains of the state, creating natural passageways for river, road, and rail cargo.
Big cities like Pittsburgh grew up, and little coal patch communities grew up around them. We call them coal patches because these little towns evolved in valleys where there was coal or other mining operations going on.
During 200 years of coal mining, Pennsylvania produced more than 25% of the nation's total coal output. It presently ranks 4th in the nation in annual production by state. Coal has brought prosperity to much of Pennsylvania, but it has also brought environmental degradation. Nowhere more so than in the town of Centralia. Centralia has been on fire, literally, for more than 40 years.
The Centralia mine fire started back in May of '62 in an abandoned stripping pit. It became very convenient for the people in Centralia to start throwing their garbage and trash in one of these stripping pits. One day the garbage and trash had caught on fire, igniting the vein of coal at the bottom of the pit.
Eventually, that fire spread through an opening in that pit down into the network of abandoned mines beneath Centralia.
Every attempt to extinguish the fire met with failure. It just kept burning and burning. Residents resigned themselves to living with it. But by the mid-1980s, the giant plumes of smoke and deadly gases made coexistence impossible.
These families started getting very sick, nauseous, extraordinary drowsiness, the classic symptoms of carbon monoxide.
Nevertheless, Centralia remained a local story and a local problem until Valentine's Day 1981, when a patch of ground collapsed beneath the feet of a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski.
All of a sudden, he drops into the ground, up to his knees, and then to his waist, and then he's out of sight, underground. And there was a huge plume of steam that came out of the ground, after that happened. And he's holding onto a tree root and yelling for help. Unfortunately, his 14-year-old cousin, Eric, was nearby, and he grabs Todd's arm and just yanks him, out of this hole. It saves his life.
The national press swooped in, and Centralia became big news.
In 1983, a federal grant was appropriated for $42 million, and that was used to buy out all the homeowners and businesses and relocate them away from the town. Our population back in the 70s and the 80s was approximately 1,100 people. Right now, our current population is 18 residents living in 9 occupied buildings. It's been difficult watching everything slowly being erased from town.
The Centralia fire continues to rage and has now spread over 400 acres. It's estimated that there's enough coal to feed the flames for another 250 years. Coal has played a more positive role in making Pennsylvania a major center for steel production.
Pennsylvania's a great place to make steel because the stars all align here for steel makers. The right kind of coal is here, which can be baked and turned into coke. The raw material, iron, is here. And the rivers are here that transport barges full of raw material and then could take the finished product to market. Andrew Carnegie was one of the first of the great steel makers in America. A young Scotsman, he figured out how to vertically integrate steel mills. That means everything that you needed to make steel came together, from the raw materials to the factories or mills to the transportation network needed to take that product to market. He figured it out early on and became the richest man in the world.
The growing industry was fueled by the armament demands of World War I. Then the development of automobile manufacturing created an expanding new market. During World War II, Pennsylvania was heralded as the arsenal of America. In that era, the state accounted for fully 1/3 of the national steel output. Tanks, planes, ships, and shells poured out of the local factories. By the late 1960s, the fortunes of the U.S. steel industry began to fade. A victim of economic recession, labor troubles, overseas competition, and an unwillingness to modernize aging facilities. As costs went up, prices went down. Mills closed and jobs disappeared. The region surrounding Pittsburgh became known as the Rust Belt.
By the 1970s and well into the 80s, the steel industry in this region really collapsed.
The old dirty industry of steel making has gone largely overseas.
Before long, clever entrepreneurs found a new use for the old mines that industry had abandoned.
One of the major products is mushrooms, which, because we have large limestone mines, which were used for steel, we have these big, huge underground mines that are perfect for growing mushrooms.
From mined mushrooms to founding fathers to Penn's Woods, Pennsylvania is truly a keystone that holds America together. With one boat for every 6 residents, this state is the boating capital of America. That should come as no surprise for a place that's known as the land of 10,000 lakes. Greetings from Minnesota, the 32nd state admitted to the Union on May 11, 1858. With 5 million people, it is the 21st most populous state.
We're a state of good enough people, good for all reasonable purposes. We're a modest people. We're ferociously modest. We may be the most modest. We may be #1 in modesty in America.
Why so modest? The winter weather is almost certainly a factor. After all, it's hard to be arrogant when you're freezing. And the land of 10,000 lakes can get cold. Very, very cold. In fact, the Twin Cities metropolis of Minneapolis-St. Paul is considered the coldest major urban area in the United States, and one of the coldest in the world. In January, the average daily high hovers around 22 degrees.
I used to live in Siberia for a while, and there are days when I'll check the weather, and it turns out it's warmer in Siberia than it is in Minnesota.
You walk down the street with your hands stuck down deep in your pocket, and your face is all red, and there's stuff coming out of your nose, and it's a magnificent time of year. I'm sorry that people can't have it everywhere in the country.
The silver lining in all this frigidity is architectural innovation. The roof of the climate-controlled Metrodome is essentially a giant Teflon-coated fiberglass baggie, which needs 250,000 cubic feet of air pressure per minute to stay inflated. When it was completed in 1981, the dome was the world's largest multi-use air-supported stadium. The chilly weather also inspired the nation's first enclosed shopping mall. That opened in Edina, Minnesota, way back in 1956. 6 years later, the famed Skyway system was built in Minneapolis, providing more than 8 miles of enclosed walkways, with 63 enclosed bridges crisscrossing 80 downtown blocks.
I do like the cold weather, but the problem is that when you have to go to court or you have to go to a business meeting and you have your nice shoes on, you can't walk out on the dirty, snowy ground or you're going to mess up your shoes. So you have to have a clean place to walk.
For escaping the cold, however, nothing quite compares with the Mall of America in Bloomington. 4.2 million square feet, 520 retail outlets, and a 7-acre amusement park, all under one roof. Believe it or not, the mall is largely unheated, but always comfortably warm, thanks to skylights, electric fixtures, and the body heat of roughly 40 million visitors a year.
On any given day, we have so many people at Mall of America that we're actually the 3rd largest city in the state of Minnesota by population. We have everything you might find in a city. We have our own police precinct office, we have our own post office, and we have our own church here at the mall.
Minnesota's name actually comes from a Sioux Indian word meaning water that reflects the sky. Not surprising for a state with 10,000 lakes and the Mississippi River.
Minnesota's Twin Cities were built on the Mississippi River. St. Paul was the head of riverboat transportation on the Mississippi River, and Minneapolis was built at St. Anthony Falls, where the sawmills initially and then flour mills were able to get water power from the river.
The river also provided excellent transport for Minnesota's early timber industry, which attracted many northern European settlers with logging backgrounds. By the 1880s, 71% of Minnesota's non-native population was first or second generation European. Half of the newcomers were Scandinavians, attracted by a climate and geography reminiscent of their northern homes. For a handful of Minnesotans today, home is so far north that it's actually in Canada. It's the only U.S. land, apart from Alaska, that exists above the 49th parallel. Known as the Northwest Angle, this geographic anomaly is the result of a mapping error made right after the American Revolution, which determined the border between the United States and Canada.
A few years ago, there was a move by the people up there to secede from Minnesota and the United States to become part of Canada. That was a kind of a ploy on their part to get better treatment in terms of both taxes and fishing rights. All 12 people wanted to secede.
About 200 miles away in northeast Minnesota, you'll find the state's economic life source, where black gold means ore, not oil. The iron ore veins of the Mesabi Range were discovered in the late 19th century.
Mining went into full swing in the 1890s, and the industry that resulted mined high-grade soft ore that could be readily mined, and this became the leading source of iron, which was used to produce steel in the U.S.
But in the 1950s, the deposits of high-grade ore were almost completely exhausted. So a team at the University of Minnesota developed a technique that would allow the extraction of ore from lower-grade rock called taconite, which was previously discarded as waste.
Taconite is a hard rock similar to flint that also contains a significant amount of iron. The taconite ore in Minnesota is about 1/3 iron, and the process developed at the University of Minnesota is able to double the iron content of the ore to about 2/3.
This new process saved Minnesota's mining industry. Since the year 2000, the Mesabi Range taconite mines have provided 2/3 of the iron used to build American cars, ships, homes, and bridges. Minnesota's business and industrial community is fueled by one of the most highly educated populations in America. Minnesotans also display a great appreciation for the arts. Minneapolis, for instance, boasts more theaters per capita than any other city outside New York. This love of culture extends to radio. In 2005, residents donated millions of dollars to Minnesota Public Radio, whose programming reaches around the globe. That success is due in large part to one of Minnesota's most prominent and recognizable citizens, Garrison Keillor.
You know, it's not like I picked out Minnesota from, a selection of states or conducted a cost-benefit analysis. I was born here.
Garrison Keillor came to work for Minnesota Public Radio in 1969 as a classical music announcer. We hired him because he had a good voice and he could pronounce all of the names of the composers on a classical radio station.
A trip by Keillor to the Grand Ole Opry radio broadcast in Nashville, Tennessee, proved inspirational.
He went to Nashville, sat in the Ryman Auditorium, watched the Opry, came back and he said, I'd like to try to do that. I'd like to have a live radio broadcast.
You're listening to a Prairie Home Companion coming to you live from the Fitzgerald Theater here in downtown St. Paul. And we did a radio broadcast in 1974, July the 6th, in front of about 20 people in the audience. Not all of them stayed until the end. I've never modeled clothing before in my life.
Who said you'd be wearing clothing, Mr. Noir?
Today, a Prairie Home Companion is broadcast over 580 stations worldwide. More than 4 million listeners tune in each week for music, stories, and characters with a distinct, Minnesota flavor.
Well, it's been a quiet week in Lake Wobegon, my hometown, out on the edge of the prairie. The one thing people should know about Minnesota, you shouldn't come unless you're prepared to stay. It's that good.
This state increases its territory every single day, a result of constant volcanic activity that deposits a steady flow of lava on its coastline. Aloha from Hawaii, the nation's 50th and most recent state. It joined the Union on August 21st, 1959. With 1.2 million people, it is the 42nd most populous state in the country. Just mention Hawaii, and picture postcard daydreams of a sun-drenched tourist paradise quickly come to mind. But most people in Hawaii are not on vacation. Local residents go about their daily business harvesting crops, hauling in fish, or working in factories, while the state's 7 million annual visitors enjoy the sights. The state even has its own breed of cowboys known as Paniolo, who ride herd on 35,000 head of cattle at the Parker Ranch. But living in paradise does have its drawbacks. In Honolulu, residents must contend with the same everyday hassles the rest of us face.
Many people are shocked to see Honolulu as a very, very densely developed, congested city. It's actually the second densest urbanized area in the entire country. It has the fewest miles of roads per person of any city in the country.
Hawaii is the only state that was once a kingdom, an independent constitutional monarchy. It has America's only royal palace, as well as its second largest telescope. The Big Island of Hawaii is home to the world's most active volcano, Kilauea, and few places can match the state for beautiful orchids. Hawaii is just as notable for the things it doesn't have, like seagulls, rabies, and daylight savings time. The Hawaiian language is also a bit lacking in letters. With only 12, it's the world's second shortest alphabet. Located 2,390 miles from California and 3,850 miles from Japan, Hawaii is the most isolated major population center on Earth. Each of its 8 largest islands is actually the top of a huge volcano that rises from the ocean floor. Agriculture is vital to the state's identity. The rich volcanic soil is perfect for coffee, sugarcane, and pineapple.
When people come to Hawaii and they want to take a gift back to their friends that says Hawaii, they will take back pineapple.
For obvious reasons, tourism is far and away Hawaii's biggest industry. Annual revenues exceed $10 billion, 24% of the state's overall economy. The first visitors to Hawaii arrived between 300 and 500 AD. These ancient trailblazers paddled across open ocean from the Marquesas Islands, some 2,000 miles to the south. Today, paddling remains a revered tradition with strong ties to the first Hawaiians.
As soon as we get in the boat, we start thinking about the ancient Hawaiians, and we try to put our spiritual culture into the paddling. It's like a spiritual thing.
For more than 1,000 years, Hawaii remained isolated from the Western world, unknown, until the arrival of Captain James Cook in 1778. Cook's discovery put the Hawaiian Islands on the map, literally. Cook, however, named them the Sandwich Islands, after one of his sponsors, John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich.
Once Cook mapped us, it was only a matter of time before many others came in. Hawaii found itself really directly in the path of that advancing European culture.
Cook himself was killed by a native in 1779 during a dispute over a stolen boat. Prior to Cook's ill-fated visit, Hawaii was ruled by feudal chieftains. In the decades that followed, the islands were unified into a single kingdom by the great warrior king Kamehameha I.
Hawaii was a separate country, just like any other country. It became a constitutional monarchy during the period of the 1800s as well, in which there were elected representatives, a system which was not unlike that of, say, England and or the United States.
By mid-century, however, Hawaii's sovereignty was threatened by American interests that favored annexation. Missionaries, shipping tycoons, and plantation owners began to exert increasing influence over control of the islands. The reigning queen, Liliuokalani, was deposed in a bloodless rebellion after just 2 years on the throne.
It was a coup that was executed in 1893 by a small, very small group of foreigners, fewer than 100 of them, really. But what they had on their side was American soldiers who landed from the USS Boston.
Not all Hawaiians embraced this new democracy, and in 1895, an armed revolt to overthrow the new government was subdued.
And after a period of what was called the Provisional Government, followed by the Republic of Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands were annexed by the USA in 1898.
After annexation, Hawaii's strategic position in the South Pacific made it ideal for an American military base. It also made it an ideal target. When Japan attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America was catapulted into World War II. The many Japanese Americans living in Hawaii and on the U.S. mainland became subject to arrest and harassment.
We'd go to the movie and we'd be trying to get a seat, walking in between people on the aisle, and here somebody from the back would yell, "Sit down, Jap," you know. That's the kind of comment.
While Japanese Americans were being imprisoned for imagined disloyalties, many of their sons were enlisting in the United States Army. The 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a combined total of 3,900 men, were composed entirely of Japanese Americans, the majority from Hawaii. The 442nd emerged as the most decorated unit in American history, but it was an honor that came with a price. An unprecedented 31.4% casualty rate earned them the nickname the Purple Heart Brigade. Together, the 442nd and 100th earned over 18,000 medals, citations, and awards. That astonishing war record finally gained them the respect they had long been denied.
We were considered like a bunch of heroes. The word Jap never did appear. Nobody mentioned that word. But it was a fairly good feeling to know that people respected you for what you did.
The post-war years brought an onslaught of decidedly peaceful invaders who wanted to conquer nothing more than the waves. 100 years ago, Western influences on Hawaii's culture led to the abandonment of many native traditions, including surfing. One man is credited with bringing this ancient sport back to life: Duke Kahanamoku. As a teenager, Duke began surfing the beaches of Oahu. Like the kings of ancient Hawaii, he used a towering solid wood board.
This board here is a turn-of-the-century solid koa board. Weighs about 130 pounds, and this is what the Duke would have been riding in Waikiki.
Most people can barely lift these boards. Duke rode them like a magic carpet.
Well, if you've ever tried one of those boards, you really respect what they did in the old days.
Duke was an athlete of stunning strength and agility. An Olympic swimmer, he won a gold medal at the 1912 Games in Stockholm and 2 gold medals in 1920 in Belgium. Duke's success also lifted surfing into the international spotlight.
During his lifetime, and I think this still is going on today, he was seen as kind of an ambassador of Hawaiian culture, of the sport of surfing, as a representative of Hawaiian culture in the Hawaiian Islands, and he fulfilled that role extremely well.
Though Duke died in 1968 at the age of 77, his legend lives on.
He had this aura about him. You know, he always held himself properly, but just to be in his presence was an honor.
On March 26, 1776, 3 months and 10 days before the Declaration of Independence, this southern state declared itself sovereign from Britain and set up its own government with its own president. Greetings from South Carolina, the 8th of the original 13 colonies to join the Union, which it did on May 23, 1788. With 4.3 million residents, it ranks 24th in population.
Music is It's so important in South Carolina. It's like there's no activity or nothing that you do that doesn't involve music in the state. And, you know, I mean, I think that's why I'm a musician. I grew up around all that.
South Carolina's musical tradition runs deep. Jazz legend Dizzy Gillespie grew up in Churall. James Brown, the godfather of soul, was born in Barnwell. And Spring Gully's most famous son is Chubby Checker, the man who shook up the dance world in 1960 with the twist. Some 40 years earlier, a jazz ensemble from the Jenkins Orphanage in Charleston traveled to New York City, where they unveiled the syncopated swing steps that came to symbolize the Roaring '20s.
I remember growing up as a kid in Charleston. It was one of those things that you actually had a class in PE where you learned to do the Charleston.
The city of Charleston has been described as a living museum. Its historic district is meticulously preserved and features some of the most beautiful homes in America. The city also boasts a notable milestone in the world of sports.
The first golf course was opened in the United States in Charleston, South Carolina in 1786. And they actually nicknamed the term green fees because of the name of the golf course, Harleston Greens.
Many of South Carolina's more than 380 golf courses are lined with palmetto trees, the revered state symbol. The palmetto is a first cousin to the towering palms found in Hawaii. During the American Revolution, rebel forces constructed a palmetto log fort on Sullivan Island, located at the mouth of Charleston Harbor.
And an entire British fleet tried to enter Charleston Harbor on June 28, 1776. And the gunners of that little palmetto log fort drove off an entire British fleet, sank 2 of the ships.
The palmetto tree is a very spongy wood, and so it was sort of a perfect material for building Fort Sullivan. The wood would actually absorb the shock of the British shot and shell. That proved pretty important for the naval victory over the British.
More than 8 decades later, the state found itself in another war, one it was instrumental in starting. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first southern state to secede from the Union. When federal troops refused to leave Charleston's Fort Sumter in April 1861, the South Carolina militia unleashed an artillery barrage that lasted 34 hours, the first shots fired in the Civil War.
South Carolinians don't mind stepping into a fight. This state fired on the United States government without a Navy and without an Army, fired a shot here that was heard around the world.
One of the most intriguing episodes in the Civil War was the saga of the H.L. Hunley, a secret weapon that some thought could have changed the entire outcome of the war. The idea came from Horace Hunley, a wealthy businessman and staunch Southern supporter.
The Confederacy at the time was undergoing a very severe naval blockade, and they were at a bit of a disadvantage. They didn't have the ships that the Union had.
Hoping to even up the odds, Hunley and his team set out to build a submersible torpedo boat. The vessel they created was 40 feet long and 3 feet wide, powered by 7 men hand cranking a propeller. On the night of February 17, 1864, the Hunley slipped into Charleston Harbor and made its way toward the Union Navy's largest warship, the USS Housatonic.
Came up about 100 yards from the Housatonic. On the decks of the Housatonic, they looked over and saw what looked like to them a mysterious porpoise or something coming up. Alarms rung, but it was too late.
The Hunley's torpedo was essentially a bomb attached to an iron ramming spar designed to deposit the explosive below the target's waterline. Approaching at 3 knots, the Hunley rammed its spar into the Housatonic and delivered its payload. The Union ship exploded and sank. Though it failed to break the siege, the Hunley had launched the first successful submarine attack in military history. But just moments later, something went terribly wrong. The little sub surfaced and signaled victory, then disappeared. In 1995, 131 years after the Hunley sank, best-selling author Clive Cussler discovered the vessel's resting place in the silt beneath Charleston Harbor. 5 years later, the Hunley was finally raised to the surface.
The Hunley was located approximately 4 miles offshore. We had a variety of artifacts that we recovered from inside the submarine, going all the way from the crew. All 8 crew members, we found skeletal remains. We also found their clothing, their shoes. Lieutenant Dixon, the commander, was carrying his pocket watch. Considering it had been on the bottom of the seabed for close to 140 years at that point, it was in very good condition.
In April 2004, the 8 members of the Hunley's crew were buried with full military honors in Charleston's Magnolia Cemetery. The Hunley itself still lives in a specially designed tank in Charleston, where archaeologists continue to study the remains of this maritime marvel. Another remarkable historical treasure can be found on the isolated sea islands off the state's southern coast. Here you'll find the direct descendants of slaves who once labored on the island's rice plantations. The distinct culture of these native islanders is called Gullah, a combination of Creole and West African languages and customs.
Gullahs endured for many years because these islands were isolated. Lots of these bridges weren't built until the early 1950s.
The Sea Island Gullah people retained many African traditions, which are evident in their cooking, wood carving, and basket weaving.
It's been in my family from my great-grandmother. My grandmother taught my mother. I work along with her. I've been doing it over 40 years.
Efforts to preserve the distinct dialect have resulted in a Gullah version of the New Testament.
Salt and light. Only just like salt for all people. But if the salt done lost its taste, ain't no way you can make them get a good taste back, Andy. Now for those who are Gullah challenged, the King James Version is printed in the margin.
I think keeping your history alive is always important. So I don't think, the Civil War or slavery or all that stuff should ever be forgotten. I think it should always be an important part of what was wrong with our state and, and what was done, and here we are in the new world being a great state.
This state was once described as high, wide, and handsome. There's plenty of room here for a 23,500 square mile U.S. Air Force base that contains 200 concrete silos housing intercontinental ballistic missiles. Welcome to Montana, the 41st state, which joined the Union on November 8, 1889. With 945,000 residents, it ranks 44th in population. Montana is the 4th largest state in territory, with 145,000 square miles. But it's 3rd smallest in population density, with just 6 people for each of those square miles. Its official nickname is the Treasure State, but everyone knows it as Big Sky Country.
I'd have to say they call Montana Big Sky Country just because it's so wide open and you can look, and sometimes you feel like you can see forever and the sky goes on and on.
You ride your motorcycle through it and it's like being on a horse 100 years ago in the western part of the United States. It's just, you're out there by yourself.
If you like thrills, however, the place to be in July is the town of Butte, home of a celebration called Knievel Days. Each summer, more than 50,000 spectators gather to witness 3 days of death-defying motorcycle stunts. The event was started by a legendary homegrown daredevil, Evel Knievel.
Evel Knievel is a big folk hero in Montana, and we don't have very many icons from Montana, so the ones you have, you really have to support.
But motorcycles may not be the only things you'll see flying through the air. Montana is one of North America's most active locations for UFO sightings.
Montana is supposedly the UFO capital of the United States. In fact, the first UFO sighting that appeared on motion picture film occurred in Great Falls, Montana in August of 1950. And that sighting really did engender the whole UFO controversy of the 1950s and 1960s.
I think a lot of people say they see UFOs because the elevation just creates a lack of oxygen.
In truth, 60% of Montana is covered by the Great Plains, even though the state's name is derived from the Spanish word for mountainous. It was the treasure within these mountains that attracted early settlers.
By the early 1860s, Gold had been discovered in a little mining camp called Bannock in southwestern Montana, and that brought hundreds of men and women to the area.
Cattle ranchers to the east saw a golden opportunity. The miners needed food, and the vast grasslands of the Montana Territory were public domain. The gold has since run out, but the cattle industry has not only endured, it's gone high-tech. The Northern Livestock Video Auction has been a boon for both cattle buyers and sellers. Auctions are broadcast via satellite at the Billings Livestock Commission's headquarters in Billings, Montana.
What we do is we video the cattle in the country, and then they show the tapes in here, and it's broadcast all over the country so you can buy over the phone.
This innovative approach to cattle ranching helps contribute more than $800 million to the state's economy. The Montana Plains, where today cattle roam, were once home to a race of giants, the dinosaurs. The first dinosaur fossil found in the Western Hemisphere was discovered in Montana in 1855 by a geologist named Ferdinand Hayden. Since then, the state has provided a treasure trove of fossils for professional paleontologists and amateur collectors alike.
This was one that I just found on my parents' property, but they're quite common. You can find them all over.
The eastern two-thirds of the state produces dinosaurs. We find literally thousands of them. We have their babies, we have their eggs, we have juveniles, we have adults.
By far, the most important discovery was made in the year 2000, a T-Rex specimen with echoes of Jurassic Park. It was dubbed B-Rex after the man who found it, Bob Harmon.
Well, I knew it was something special because it was a Tyrannosaurus foot bone. Probably 40% of the rest of the animal was there, legs and arms.
In the bones of Tyrannosaurus rex, we found soft tissue. We found the remnants of red blood cells. And in fact, we expect one day to get DNA out of this dinosaur. I wouldn't go so far as to say that we can do what they did in Jurassic Park, but the B-Rex specimen is definitely giving us more information than any other dinosaur ever has.
The first record of human population in what is today Montana dates back around 10,000 years. Later, bountiful food and game made this a rich homeland for the Cheyenne, Crow, and several other native tribes. But ultimately, encroachment by white settlers and the troops that defended them led to one of the most significant battles in the development of the American West.
Battle of Little Bighorn really signaled the end of the Indian way of life in Montana.
It's remembered as Custer's Last Stand. On June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry were trapped and wiped out by a much larger native force, led by the legendary warriors Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. The Indians won that day, but the reprisals would be swift and harsh.
The people back east were shocked and appalled that Custer could be killed by what they felt were a handful of savage people in Montana. And the repercussions were that the military became extremely aggressive, and they started attacking the Indian tribes with a lot more vigor than they had before and forcing them back onto the reservations. And so even though the Indians won the battle, the military made sure that they lost the war.
To me, not only as a park ranger here and also as a Crow tribal member, this place is, sacred land.
Most Montanans would agree. In the words of local cowboy poet Mike Logan, living in Montana is like spending every day in heaven.